let's go to the dungeon debate.
So this is kind of interesting. It's for giggles, I feel like, of sorts. But it's Dungeons versus Dragons.
Yeah, so this is the last episode
of
season 1. So this was an experimental, but it seems to be fitting for the last one. But yeah, Dungeons versus Dragons. Which one is better? Which one is more important? Which one is more iconic? Any question that fits under this. Basically, which one is better?
Well, if we're talking iconic, then the dragon wins.
We're talking better. So
we're talking about
for the game Dungeons and Dragons, which is better, Dungeons or Dragons? That's the question. I think Dungeons.
I think Dragons.
Okay. Yes. You can go if you want.
So I do want to say Dungeons and Dragons are very different things. A dungeon is an environment, while dragons are NPCs and more. You see, dragons have the best of lore in the game. They also are the most iconic monster and thing to fight in the game. And also, if you have a dragon in your game, it's the most memorable in your campaign.
I mean, all that is not necessarily true.
It's very true.
They are iconic. That does not mean they're most memorable in the game.
I think they're way more memorable than a dungeon.
That is completely subjective.
No.
It depends on the dungeon. It depends on how you play the dragon.
Most people think, they would think like, oh, that dragon fight. They would remember the dragon more than the dungeon, but just factual.
I don't agree.
They made a whole book about dragons. They didn't make a whole book about dungeons. Just put that into perspective.
Well, that's...
Dungeons is an add-on to the dragon.
So let's say... If you had to lose one, which one would you lose? I think if you were to say Dungeons, you'd be dumb. Dungeons is a core component of the game. It is the most vital part of the game, actually. Dungeons are, I'd say, the biggest part of the game. And everything around a dungeon is add-ons.
Well, but what classifies something as a dungeon, though?
That's a good question. So I would say a dungeon is basically somewhat of a closed environment that puts the players through challenges and typically ends with some sort of climax, which is typically combat. And it's these challenges and these fighting and these contained options, do you go this hallway or this hallway, that create the best parts of D&D, right? It's the game of D&D is you are in some form of dungeon, right? It's called Dungeons and Dragons, right? So dragons are in the name because they are the most iconic fantasy creature. So that makes sense. But dungeons are in the game because it is the game, right? That a dungeon is the game part. Dragons is the theme part. It's a fantasy game, but the actual structure of the game is dungeons. You know what I mean? Sure, there's role playing, there's exploring, but these things are really all around a dungeon. If you took out dungeons, you wouldn't have this game anymore. If you took out dragons, you would have the game. It being called Dungeons and Dragons wouldn't make much sense, but you could entire campaigns exist without dragons in them. Easily. You can't have entire campaigns without dungeons. You can, it's not the same game. It's a different game. You know what I mean? So that's why I think dungeons are much more vital to the game.
If you say more vital, that makes sense. But personally, I think that what makes the game more exciting, because dungeons are again dungeons. So they're very they kind of copy and paste. I know you can change some things, but dungeons are dungeons.
Are you trying to say dragons are completely different from one another?
Each dragon is different, though.
I'd say dungeons have more differences from each other than dragons.
No, but the thing is, every dungeon, for the player's perspective, especially for me, I always feel the same when I'm in a dungeon. You know what I'm saying? I always have the same feeling when I'm in a dungeon.
But they can take such different... A dungeon isn't always an underground cave. I mean, there's so many different options.
Well, there's a tower, a castle, and an underground cave. You cannot call actual landscape a dungeon.
Are you serious?
It's all indoor stuff. There's also the other side of outdoor, which dragons can be in both.
Well, dungeons. Okay, if you have a creative DM, a dungeon can be practically anything. I'll try to think of something off the top of my head. If you are, a dungeon could be a city. It could be. Like, let's say
guess so.
It's all about how the structure of it is going. So let's say it's like, let's say you need to get to the king, and you need to get to his royal palace.
You would not call that a dungeon. No one would call that a dungeon.
I guess a dungeon has exploring involved.
A dungeon has exploring. It also needs, like, traps,
Yeah,
general
but these
monsters.
traps can be like robbers on the street.
That's
You know what I mean?
not a dungeon. No one would call that a dungeon, though.
I guess it's a little bit of a stretch, but
That's
the
a
point,
mega stretch.
The point of it could be like falling out of the sky, right? In a certain way. Like, that could really
How
create
is that a
like
dungeon?
maybe you're falling from the upper planes to the lower planes.
But
and somehow it's like a tunnel of energy. And it's like you're falling. And
But when you be like, there's two pathways. Let me just think for a little bit. As you're falling, you're like, I don't know really which one to, and you're dead. People want to call that dungeon. A dungeon,
No, it's magical.
in my opinion, dungeons aren't just magic. Magic aren't dungeons.
No, I'm saying this is just a creative version of a dungeon.
Ah.
So like, let's say you're falling, and it's like, okay, you guys are falling, but
You can't explore.
you'll be
while you're
falling forever, and falling with you are these artifacts, and so you have like a little puzzle, and then if you do the puzzle, you find out if you do the puzzle in a certain way,
But that's a puzzle, not a dungeon.
you will either fall faster or fall slower.
But that's a puzzle, not a dungeon. Dungeons have variety.
No.
of things.
But you can choose how you fall, and how you fall and the speed at which you fall will dictate where you arrive. And when you arrive, that will have its own differences. So, like, you may be looking at the symbols and being like, do we want to combine fire with fire? Or do we want fire and water to put it out, and then maybe that would stop us, while fire and fire would make us go quicker, and then we'll fall straight into the abyss because we'll go so far down.
But that is still not a dungeon, though.
Why
That is
not?
definitely not a dungeon. Because dungeons, as most people classify them, dungeons are usually layers, underground places, buildings that are abandoned.
You just said the word usually. I understand that. I'm giving you that they don't have to be.
But no one would say that's a dungeon, though. Because that only has a puzzle and a location. There has to be many valuable points
you
in
do.
a dungeon.
Okay, let's say you go fire. Oh my god, we start falling faster. And then there's things that start falling. As you fall, flames start to come up in like demons, and now you have to fight mid-air. Dun, 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 dun. And then you see that like the raveling of the wind tunnel is starting to split. And it's like, do we go right or left?
But
it's
basically,
like the demons seem to be coming from the right.
But basically, it's the same formula.
It's just a dungeon that keeps you moving.
But it's the same formula, though.
But that formula is the game. That is the game Dungeons & Dragons.
Not necessarily.
Every game is a formula.
But that's not the entire formula of Dungeons.
It's not the entire formula.
That's a vital point.
It's the most vital
But
formula.
I'm saying dragons can be in all of them. They can be in the dungeons. They can be in the cities. They can be in the role acting, which is also giant.
And they can also be in other games. So that's why they're not important.
Dungeons can be in other games. They're Minecraft dungeons.
It's like saying, what is better in Minecraft? To have the Ender Dragon or to have blocks or to have the mining, like the mine feature?
That is
Yes, it is.
You would say mines or the Ender Dragon. That would make sense.
No, but
mining
the ability to mine. Which one would make more sense in Minecraft? The ability to mine or Ender Dragons?
But that's not even close. Because you can have a campaign without a dungeon. You can have one.
You will not have a campaign without a dungeon.
You can.
What would it be?
It's possible.
What would it be?
I don't know. Like you have to make
It's not Dungeons and Dragons anymore. It's just role playing constantly.
No, it's not just role playing. You can have combat on the outside, or maybe like you go in the forest.
But if you have something that leads to something that leads to something that leads to something, and it's in some form of structure of puzzles and clues and whatever, that's a dungeon. You know what I mean?
No, because a dungeon needs clues. It needs puzzles, it needs enemies, and it needs rewards. You can have like a detective murder mystery, which is like you walk in, that's the clue part. That does not make it a dungeon, though.
No, but let's say
you can go to a separate part, and then you have a fighting.
You're not going to be able to avoid a dungeon structure. So let's say you are the detective, and then you get to like the final house that you've led all the clues to. That is a dungeon. You're gonna walk in, and there's gonna be things.
But
and those things are
but
gonna be
it doesn't have to be the house though. Maybe you
Well,
go and then you go to like the government and you're like, this man is the true killer, and then they bring the killer in, and then the killer starts the combat. It doesn't have to be. It's not just
That
dungeons.
sounds terrible because you want you want a dungeon because that's the players doing stuff actively. If it's like, I know who the detective is, and then these NPCs go get him in the dungeon, you're just skipping the dungeon. That's not fun.
Well,
Yes, you can skip the dungeons, but the dungeons are the fun part.
Well, it might not be in the dungeon. They could be fleeing in the open fields. They could be running away. Dungeons in the
Sure.
in the Dungeon Master's Manual is only a chapter in the entire book. Is only a chapter in the entire book. There are
Right.
multiple
An entire
parts about
chapter.
dragons are in dungeons and more chapters than dungeons.
But
They
okay.
can be used a lot more than
No,
dungeons.
That's a completely
You can, though.
That's not a correlation there.
Yeah, it is.
More pages in a book does not equal more uses.
No,
There's
but
just a bunch of information about dragons.
you are basically taking a location and an entity, dragons themselves, and multiple
it's not
dragons.
just a location; it's a type of location.
Right, it's a
and
type.
It's the most important.
No, it's not the most important.
A
though.
dungeon.
You
It's
can
in the
no,
title.
but dragons you can put them in all of them, in every type of
But
situation.
you don't
can put
need
them
dragons.
You don't need dungeons either. It's a
Oh my
type
God.
of format.
If you take out dungeons, you're missing half of the game. You are. Period.
That's not
You
half
can
the game. though.
technically avoid them, but it's the most fun parts of the game. It is the classic most. It is the game that
Well, no,
has the dragons.
you just said it's the classic. The
No, no, no,
classic
listen.
monster is the dragon.
Listen.
Let me talk about my part with the dragons because
haven't finished my thought.
we've only talked about dungeons for like 10 minutes. So let me talk about my dragon. part.
Let me just finish
No,
my
no, no,
point.
but-
You haven't got my point.
No, yes, I have. Basically,
It's like two sentences.
You literally said dungeons are basically the most vital things in the game.
No, listen.
That's basically it.
I haven't explained. You cannot replace a dungeon with anything else. If you take a dungeon out, there is now a void in the game that will make the game less fun. You can replace dragons with anything, and it will be the same game.
It's not going to be as good, though.
It could be better. It just depends on what you put,
Well,
and that's subjective. Like, some people don't like dragons. Maybe
I
they
don't
think they're basic.
personally. For me, dungeons are also subjective. I don't like dungeons either. Dungeons have a certain formula. If
dungeons
one of
can
the
take so many
no,
different
no, but the
forms.
thing is, if one of them is missing, that's not a dungeon. That does not classify. A dungeon needs multiple parts for it to be a dungeon. So the term dungeon needs, as again, puzzles, enemies, and rewards.
It doesn't
Clues.
have to have all those things.
It needs to have all of those. A detective.
That's a complete false statement.
That is-
You
no,
could
that's
have
true.
a dungeon that's just straight fighting.
That is not a dungeon.
You could.
That
Yes,
is
you could.
that is a combat encounter. No one would call that a dungeon.
Let's say you have a cave and you're running through the halls.
What
and
happens
You encounter
if-
goblins.
what-
Okay, like if you go into a goblin cave, it doesn't. Let's say you have traps and you have enemies. You don't need puzzles. It's still a dungeon.
Wait, no, but what happens if it's not a cave? It's just the forest. That is not a dungeon.
I'm not
No
saying
one
that's a
would-
dungeon, but I'm saying you don't need all those things.
Well, most of the time, for a typical dungeon, you need to be somewhere that is not outside. That's usually
A
what
dungeon
people
needs to be
classify.
somehow contained. Yes.
Yes.
But that's important.
But remember, most of the game, you can be outside of a enclosed area. Like you just said,
can't.
dungeons are only enclosed areas. That can't be that air thing which you're falling
You
down.
could, you
That is
could. You
not
could
a
be creative
dungeon.
about
That
it.
is not a dungeon. No one would say that's a dungeon. Remember, dungeons have a term. They are physical structures.
Are
That
you
is-
even a
that-
DM? That's
Yes.
very close-minded. You can be creative with these structures. So if it's like walk into room 1, you find this. Room 2 has this. Room 3 has this. If you want to make that spaces of air and you guys are flying around heaven, that's the same thing. Oh, there's this. Oh, that's weird. This yellow cloud has this. This white cloud has this. This red cloud
But
has this.
exactly.
It's the same
no,
idea.
no, but you're saying that's a formula, though.
Yeah, that is what I'm saying.
Dungeons only have a formula.
They
while
do have a
dragons do not need a formula, though. They don't.
Of course, the formula is the game.
You-
though. Have
you-
you ever played chess? Well, knights have a formula. Rooks have a formula. That's
No,
because
chess,
that's the game.
chess and Dungeons and Dragons are entirely different.
Name a game that does not have a formula. You will not be able to do it.
Well,
And
but
that formula is the game.
that is not the only game. Remember, Dungeons and Dragons is a role-playing game. That is just a part of the... Dungeons are only a part and a very fun part of the game. It's not the entire game.
Yes, but you can't just start role playing like you're like, oh, I'm Captain Picard and we're going on a space adventure. It's all about role playing in a certain setting, and dungeons are the setting that you role play.
It's not
Not just dungeons.
It can't just be dungeons, though. I'm saying
in no way am I saying
you're saying dungeons are more vital than something that can be number one. Doesn't have to be just a monster. They are.
Yes, I am saying that.
No, that's false though. You're taking
Explain.
You're,
All right, explain
you're
your
basically,
dragon idea.
You're basically taking the best role playing creature in the game. Dragons are the best role playing thing in the game.
Listen, you take a dungeon, you take it out, you can't replace it. It's just the game is worse now. If you take a dragon, you can replace it with anything, and it will be better. You could. What is your favorite thing about a dragon? It's amazing role playing capabilities.
Yes.
Okay.
And also that you can use it for anything in the game because they're so versatile.
Right.
In the game.
To put a storm giant in instead.
That it would not be nearly as the same. It would not be as good.
It would feel different.
But
it can fulfill.
But storm giants would not bring the same the same versatility as a dragon would. You can use dragons in so many better ways than a giant, though.
Let's say if someone said to you, okay, you have to make an amazing campaign, but without dragons, how hard would that be?
Well,
it wouldn't be hard. You have a million options.
Well, no.
If I said make an amazing campaign without dungeons, you would be like, what? Yeah, I mean, like
it's possible. Though.
It's possible.
It's still
maybe,
possible.
But you couldn't do it that many times. It'd be get old. It'd be like, oh, this is just role playing.
What? Well, no, but it's not just role playing.
You
though.
limit your
substantially.
No,
but you're saying combat strategies are dungeons, which they're not.
No, basically, I'm not saying that.
No. Dungeons are all those things mixed together in very short terms. You can have those spread out. Those are not counting as dungeons.
Okay.
You can still have all those properties.
You're getting caught up in the second part. The first part, can you make an amazing campaign without dragons? The answer is easily. When I say that for dungeons, the answer is not easily. Sure, it's like, I guess if I get really creative, but dragons, it's like, oh, yeah, of course I can. There's no question that you'd be able to do that because they're not vital. They're iconic, but they're not vital.
They are very good to use in the game, though.
I don't
Name
disagree.
one thing that can replace a dragon. One thing.
Well, what do you replace? What part of the dragon?
Any part. Name one thing that is equal par.
That's nothing special about a dragon.
That is very special about a dragon.
No, but name anything that can replace a goblin.
A kobold.
Technically not.
Kobold.
Well,
easily.
Okay.
They're exactly the same.
Okay, a Draco Lich then.
That's a dragon.
No, it's not. It's a Draco Lich.
That's a dragon.
Dragons are alive.
Draco Lich. No, Draco Liches count as a dragon.
Okay, a drake.
A drake is a type of dragon. Sure that's an animal. You can make that a giant bird.
I don't know my creatures well enough, but
you can make that a giant bird. Name one thing that has the equal versatility in the game as a dragon.
A flying rock.
Nope.
Like, with the intelligence of a wizard that can breathe fire.
Nope. Well, that's a dragon.
No, it's not. No, it's not. It's a giant bird.
No, you can't do that.
Yes, you can.
No, you can't.
That's what D&D is.
No.
What do you think a kobold is? It's a goblin that looks like a dragon. Period. Right? That's all it is. That's how D&D works.
But that's not a dragon, though. Because that's just breaking the rules of the game.
A
you can just take out the dungeon and just make it this dungeon more spaced out. Because there is, a actual formula to a dungeon. You could just not put a dungeon. You can still do that. You can still do that and make the game still very fun. I'm saying there's nothing in the actual game that competes with dragons and versatility. Dragons are the best.
That's fine.
They can be the best NPCs. The best monsters.
Yeah.
They're the best world building in the game.
No, that's fine. They can be the best creature in the game.
The
thing is, I'm not arguing on behalf of another creature.
But dragons also make the world way better. More alive than a dungeon.
There's no point in having
Dungeons are a lot more short, while dragons are the better storytellers, the best memorable encounters as you think of the dragon, not the dungeon.
But you can't experience the full experience of a dragon unless you have, imagine
you don't need a dungeon.
The only dragon encounter you can have is fighting them in the open field.
That's not true.
What else can you have?
That's not true. You can have them polymorphed as someone else fighting man to man in a castle. You can still do that.
In a castle?
That is not a dungeon.
Well, how'd you get there?
building.
You didn't put any puzzles or traps before you got there? That
No,
sounds really boring.
maybe they're evil people and they walked up to the metallic dragon and they started fighting each other. You cannot
But
say
that's
that
not
a
an-
castle
that's
is
not
not a
interesting.
dungeon. A dungeon has a formula. A dungeon has a
That's
formula.
a very important formula.
But you can still play the game without it. Remember, it's a role playing game.
Yes, that
you
doesn't-
are taking out the
that's not an
entire
argument.
role playing
You can play
part
the game
with a
without-
dungeon. You can do both with dragons.
Let's look at statistics. How often do people have campaigns without dungeons? 0%. You could, technically, it never happens because why would you do that? Dungeons are awesome. How often do people have campaigns without dragons? All the time.
Not all the-
Actually, if you were to poll everyone here virtually, how many of you how many times have you actually fought a dragon? How many times? You think dragons are these super pervasive creatures. I've only fought one once.
Well, remember, we are novice.
How
in
many
playing the
times
game.
have you fought a dragon?
4?
4 out of all the times you played D&D. So clearly something else is taking your attention. But how many times have you been in a dungeon? All the time.
Not all the time. I
Almost all the
honestly
time.
equal amounts in Dungeons and Dragons. Technically, equal amounts.
No way.
Because
I know
remember
that
you
is
can
false for a
no,
fact.
no, but remember you can really only do like a dungeon maybe once or twice in a campaign.
Wait, what? You know the
You
first,
cannot
remember the-
overuse dungeons.
Remember the first campaign you played?
Yes.
Sorry, not the first. Yeah, the first. Wait, no. The one. Remember the cave one where you start in like the carved painting room?
You made that one. Yes.
Yes, that entire place is a dungeon. You never left the dungeon.
That's technically one dungeon though.
Yeah, but it created all the fun that you had throughout all the sessions was in that dungeon.
Well, remember.
Imagine that not being what it was. I couldn't have made that. What? It's a cave wall that you're trapped in, but actually there's no roof, I guess. Like there's so many things you have to have a dungeon for.
But remember, the more memorable parts for me was the stuff on the outside. You put
What was on the outside?
a dragon. You put a dragon.
Wait, what? When did I put a dragon?
Yeah, the dragon on the top of the cave. You put a dragon.
Oh, that was.
You put a white dragon as a illusion. Remember?
Oh, right, the moral
right.
quandary.
That was the
an
first
illusion
campaign
within the dungeon.
That was the most memorable part of that entire dungeon
Because it killed you.
No, it didn't kill us. It was
an illusion, but it made you think you died for a second.
Well, that's not saying that's the dungeon though. We think of the dragon, not the dungeon that did that. We think
That's
of
the magic
dragon.
of a dungeon, though. Like, sure, dragons are awesome. I don't disagree with that. But the none of anything I did could have existed without a dungeon.
But-
and your eye just twitched. Like, literally, it just, like on a cartoon, like if someone's like angry, like their eye twitches.
I'm not
you
angry.
literally did that.
I'm not angry.
Like,
but-
just one of your eyes, the bottom, like, lip of your eye.
Like
just,
this?
Like,
Like
lid,
my
like
eyelid?
yes, like, twitched up and down.
I don't know what causes that. Well, remember, what I'm saying is dragons, remember, they have a whole book to them. Do not underestimate dragons. Dragons can be
don't
crafters
underestimate
of dungeons. They can be used in every part of the game. Dungeons are just dungeons. Yes, dungeons are probably the best part of the game, but they're dungeons. You're taking out the entire role-playing part of everything. That illusion isn't the dungeon itself. It's a illusion of the dragon. You know what I'm saying? Like, people think of the dragon more than the dungeon. Unless you're playing, I am in a campaign which is an entire dungeon, and it's a really good dungeon. And, it's a dungeon-themed campaign.
Yep.
But people having a dragon-themed campaign, Tyranny of Dragons, is so good.
Have you ever...
There's...
we should probably call this close tune, but have you ever heard of a Brachyllus creature?
Brachyllus?
Yeah, have you ever heard of a Brachyllus?
No.
Well, a Brachyllus is the most versatile, the most fun, the most amazing fantasy creature to ever exist. And it's not in the game Dungeons & Dragons.
What's it? Wait, what's it in?
So...
If you're telling me this thing is a dungeon...
No, it's not a dungeon. It's a completely imaginary creature that I just came up with. But it is the best. But the fact that it's not in Dungeons & Dragons doesn't matter. The game is still fun. So sure, if it was in the game, it would be cool. But it's not, and it doesn't matter. Dragons are the same thing. They're awesome in the game, and I'm glad they're there. But if you were to take them out, the game would still be what it is. It'd be just as fun. It would be just as versatile. You could do just as much stuff. Just because there's no Bracolisk or no dragon doesn't mean anything.
You
But
better
if
make
you
that a
take the
monster.
dungeon out, the game is not its game anymore.
No, I mean you can still make it if the DM is
But
able to.
it's-
You can still make the campaign still good without a physical dungeon.
But
Remember,
it changes everything.
people don't think as dungeons as like when you think of a dungeon, what comes in your head? What do you think? Like when someone says a dungeon, what comes in your head?
The game Dungeons and Dragons.
No,
I picture adventurers going into something mysterious and something they cannot flee from.
Exactly.
It's obstacles that come their way that are unknown and they must meet and they must be ready to interact with.
Well, no, but you said they're going in.
Yeah, so let's say you're deep in a dungeon, right? You can't just like start flying away or like run through the field.
Maybe you
Like,
could.
Anything could happen in a dungeon. You never know what you're going to encounter. When you're in the open forest, you're in a forest. You know what's going on. But a dungeon is like special.
Well, I mean, do you really know what's going on in the forest, though?
There's only so many things that make any sense. Sure, there's a lot of versatility.
Well,
but
remember, magic is magic.
in the end, dragons are awesome, but are more vital to the game. They are the structure of the game, Dungeons and Dragons. Sure, they're not 100% of it, but they are the biggest chunk. And although dragons are awesome and iconic, they can be replaced. Well, dungeons can't. That's all I gotta say.
I mean, dragons can't really be replaced as well as a dragon could.
They can be replaced easier than a dungeon. I'll say that at least.
Okay. Well, with my argument is that dragons themselves are the best at every quality of the game. The end boss, the best villains, the best allies, the best friends, the best character creation, the best. You can make great characters with the theme of dragons. Dragons pull up with the best lore in the game and the best memories of the game. When we all think of Dungeons and Dragons, we think of players in a dungeon killing a dragon.
Wow.
Wow.
All
Or
right.
actually, are layers dungeon? I guess they are dungeons.
Yeah, they are dungeons,
Yeah.
exactly.
But the flying
So you wouldn't
air,
have the big
air.
Bilbo stealing the stone or whatever from the smog. Anyway,
But remember,
dungeon.
Smog is more memorable than the Erebor.
I don't know. I think Thorin remembers his
People
golden layer more
Only
than
Thorin, but everyone else is like, bro, Smog is a...
No, that's not true. The Misty Mountains, that's all about their dungeon.
But-
That's about their lair.
But who really thinks...
They all were like, we want our dungeon home back.
But when you think of The Hobbit, do you think of the Misty Mountains or do you think of Smog? Most people think of Smog. Smogs
know.
are bring out the
I
fun and the
definitely
most
think
memorable.
of the song. But anyway, all right.
Well, the song.
This episode ended up being long because of this debate. But it was a big debate. I mean, Dungeons versus Dragons, right? That's a big one.
They're so like opposite though. Like you can't. I don't know. Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
All right, but we want you to decide, listeners and viewers.
Who won that
Who won the debate? Please tell us. Yes.